Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The title of this session, Endgame, is a very unique Korean idiom, that is 끝장토론, which means the final or endless intensive talk. The closest translation I can think of it is the papal conclave, which continues hard debate until white smoke comes out of chimney. But unfortunately, we have only 1 hour and 20 minutes. To make session more interactive, I already sent some questions to the presenters in advance. First, what's the ultimate goal of North Korea? Is dialogue or negotiation with North Korea possible? Second, if negotiation is possible, what could be the starting point? What about Leap Day agreement between US and North Korea in 2012? Or dual suspension recently suggested by China? Third, if and when we find that there is no exit, what options are possible? First, preventive military options possible or feasible? Two, can redeployment of tactical nuclear weapon as a solution as part of complementary measures? Could European patterns of nuclear sharing be applied to Korea? And will going nuclear be the ultimate or last legitimate options for Republic of Korea in case of reliability of the US extended deterrence is seriously questioned? With such a scenario, set off a nuclear cascade in the region involving Japan and Taiwan. Fourth, what is the definition of the so-called red line? I heard some expert calling it a red carpet instead of red line because there are too many red lines in the past. The red line, from my point of view, I think it's any situation where Korean people lose confidence in the validity of US extended deterrence. Fifth, when should UN impose a full embargo on crude oil export to North Korea? And can we expect progressive changes in the Chinese government response to the third issues after the 9th Party Congress tomorrow? Maybe tomorrow it will start. What is the difference between sanctions against the North and those against Iran? What kind of element of the Iranian nuclear agreement are applicable to sanctions against the North Korea? Maybe last question was, what do you think of Henry Kissinger's idea on a next bargaining deal between US and China? I don't expect all of you will respond to all of these questions within 5 minutes. So maybe, but I think that I will. I hope you will make a very succinct as possible. So I'll give you initial 7 minutes for your first round of talk, and then I will give 1 or 2 on-the-spot questions. Maybe and then you can answer during the second round, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And then we will open the floors. So today, and we'll have many ambassadors and the former unsung heroes during the negotiation with North Korea, including former Foreign Minister Han Seung-ju and also U.S. representative of Six Party Talk, Chris here. So, you will have some very quick, comment after the meeting is the presentation is over. The presentation will be made in order of U.S. panelists and Chinese panelists and then the Korean panelists. The order is not based on GDP, but the distance they had to fly to be here. So, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Gary Seymour is the Executive Director for Research of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. We first met in 1992 in Washington, D.C., when U.S. and Korea were trying to deal with the first nuclear crisis. Even though the assessment of that work is diversified. He served and also we served in the joint team that established the KIDO to provide light water reactor to North Korea. He has served both the Clinton and Obama administration in the White House as the top-level advisors to the president on arms control and the weapons of mass destruction. It is my pleasure to welcome the most well-known working dictionary on these hard issues. Gary, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, President Pak, and thank you to the World Knowledge Summit for bringing us all together to talk about this devilishly difficult issue. I personally have worked on it for more than 30 years, and I can say with great confidence that even though we've tried just about everything, from economic sanctions to diplomatic deals to military threats, I think we can say with confidence that we failed. We haven't been able to stop North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles. And I think at this point it's very unlikely that we will prevent Kim Jong-un from continuing his testing campaign until he demonstrates a credible capability to threaten the United States directly with nuclear weapons. I don't know how long that will take. I think it's very difficult to make an assessment. But given the last 2 years of accelerated nuclear and missile testing, I think we can expect that North Korea is on the verge of having a credible ability to threaten the United States directly. And that will create a new security dilemma for the US and its allies. Once Kim Jong-un has demonstrated such a capability, will North Korea be tempted to take more aggressive actions towards South Korea in the belief that North Korea is protected by a nuclear umbrella? How will the US and its allies, the ROK and Japan, develop credible extended deterrence? How will we relieve pressure on the ROK and Japan to develop their own nuclear deterrent in order to protect themselves? And finally, how will the US and China work with each other in order to prevent war on the Korean Peninsula, which is an important common interest that Beijing and Washington have? So I think we have to accept the reality that we're going to be living with a nuclear-armed North Korea for the foreseeable future. As a practical matter, denuclearization is no longer a realistic objective, at least as long as the Kim dynasty rules in Pyongyang. So what should we do? Let me make 3 suggestions. First, I think the Trump administration's official policy, which is maximum pressure and engagement, is the right approach. Military options are not practical. Regime change is not realistic. But we should try to build up our economic and political leverage to use in a diplomatic agreement if that opportunity ever presents itself. And we know Secretary of State Tillerson is trying to work with the Chinese and South Korea and other players in order to come up with an approach to resume to resume negotiations with North Korea, even if President Trump tweets language that undercuts the Secretary of State. His own government is trying to find a way back to the bargaining table. But secondly, Kim Jong-un is simply not receptive right now. As I suggested, he hasn't achieved whatever strategic objective he is seeking in terms of demonstrating a nuclear and missile capability. So I think for the time being, Kim Jong-un will continue to test. He may test to embarrass Xi Jinping during the Party Congress. He may do something to embarrass President Trump when he's visiting Asia, coming to Seoul. In any event, I view all this testing as an opportunity to build up economic pressure. I think we've seen in the last 2 years, Beijing has gradually moved more in the direction of supporting UN Security Council sanctions that affect the general North Korean economy. Most recently, for the first time, measures that could affect oil exports to North Korea. So I think we'll have an opportunity, as Kim Jong-un continues to test, to build up our pressure through economic sanctions. To be clear, I don't think these sanctions are going to cause a collapse of the North Korean economy. I don't think they'll provoke a revolution in the countryside or even a palace coup in Pyongyang. But I do think they increase the cost of testing and they create bargaining leverage. So at some point, if Kim Jong-un decides he's demonstrated a sufficient capability, he may be willing to come back to the bargaining table, and we'll have to figure out, US, ROK, Japan, China, Russia, what is the most sensible diplomatic approach? How do we trade our bargaining leverage for constraints on the nuclear and missile program? This is not going to eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles, but if we can constrain them, that's a better approach than having an unconstrained program. But we know from history that diplomacy is not likely to produce a permanent solution. All the previous nuclear deals with North Korea have collapsed because of North Korean cheating or because the North Koreans made a decision to renege on the deal. So at the end of the day, diplomacy is not likely to do more than delay and limit. And my third point is that given that fact, it's important for us to invest in the defense, including missile defense, necessary to deter a North Korean attack on the US or US allies. I think we still have a very strong ability to prevent war. We have tremendous economic and military advantages over North Korea, and it's important that we continue to expand those advantages, both conventional and military, and as well as nuclear, in order to ensure that Kim Jong-un understands that any attack on South Korea or on the US would be suicidal. So I'll end there with my somewhat grim predictions about the future, but I think if we can prevent nuclear use and war, I think that will be a very significant achievement.
If I give some short question, you mentioned that the diplomacy during the last 20 plus years was not so successful. But from my point of view, the predominant reason is that the U.S. government didn't put top priority to these North Korean issues. So that's why Chinese government also didn't put top priority to these issues. But fortunately, Trump seems to give top priority to these issues. But the problem is sustainability. How President continuously put top priority to these issues. So maybe you could make some comment on that issues. And on the issue of the maximum prevention, maximize our deterrence, the capabilities. I have some practical questions on, in case of North Korean nuclear, whatever attack on Guam. So maybe in case of NATO Article 5, any attack on the the member state in North America and Europe, has some give some obligation to all NATO members to do something. So maybe if North Korea attack Guam, so maybe it constitutes the violation of the chapter Article 5 of the NATO Charter. So which means that all European NATO members should join joint démarche against North Korea. So maybe what do you think of that argument? And then I read a very interesting article yourself in the Nationalist on May 31st. Maybe you mentioned that placing a thin Chinese military contingent along the 38th parallel. Do you remember? Yeah. So maybe I wonder if your idea has any connotation or any implication with the current Dr. Kissinger's new big deal between U.S. and China. Okay, you may respond right now, or you could use next round of talk.
Why don't I wait and give my colleagues a chance to talk?
Hi, Bruce.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's the first time I've...
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot introducing you. Just give me 2 minutes. Our second speaker is Bruce Klingner, who will give us a view from conservative, side of United States. I'm not sure how close he is to President Trump, but he certainly seems to be a powerful speaker on behalf of the Trump administration through his well-circulated commentaries and articles. He's currently at the Heritage Foundation as a senior research fellow, and also 20 years of his career were spent at Central Intelligence Agencies and Defense Intelligence Agency. Usually his business was focused on Korea and Japan and China. Maybe some of you already be familiar with him because he's very frequently on TV as a leading commentators on the CNN, Fox News, and others. Let's welcome Mr. Klingner. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've played to a stadium and entered onto the stage with our own theme music, or seen myself that large. So it's quite a new experience for me. It's a pleasure to be here, although we come, of course, under the sort of the dire shadow of the growing North Korean threat to the United States and our allies. So North Korea's successful test of a hydrogen bomb, as well as increasing progress towards an ICBM that could threaten the American homeland, has certainly energized debate within the United States and around the world, really, about how the U.S. should respond to those tests, as well as what President Trump's overall policy towards North Korea should be. And the imminence of North Korea crossing that ICBM threshold has triggered greater advocacy by some in the United States for a preventative military attack to keep North Korea from achieving that objective. We've seen public comments by the President and other senior officials that would suggest that the U.S. is contemplating such a strike. But intercepting missile test flights that do not clearly pose a security threat, or military strikes on North Korean soil, they risk triggering an all-out war with catastrophic consequences. So I would argue that while the U.S. should be steadfast in its defense of its territory and its allies, it should save a preemptive strike for indications of imminent North Korean attack on ourselves or our allies. Now, conversely, others are pushing for a premature return to negotiations, insisting that it's the only way to constrain Pyongyang's growing nuclear arsenal. But there really would be little utility to such negotiations as long as Pyongyang rejects the basic premise, which is the abandonment of its nuclear weapons and its programs. So we've had numerous North Korean agreements pledging never to develop nuclear weapons, and then a number of subsequent agreements pledging to give up the weapons they promised never to build in the first place. And by word and deed, North Korea has repeatedly, emphatically shown that it has no intention of abandoning its nuclear arsenal. And they've made clear in public and private meetings that denuclearization is off the table, and there's nothing that either Washington or Seoul could offer to induce them to do so. For the past 20 or 25 years, we've had two-party, three-party, four-party, six-party talks to resolve the issue. All have failed. The U.S. and its allies have offered economic benefits, developmental assistance, humanitarian assistance, diplomatic recognition, declaration of non-hostility, turning a blind eye to violations and non-implementation of U.S. laws, all to no avail. And Seoul has signed 240 inter-Korean agreements, obviously not all nuclear related, and offered extensive economic and diplomatic inducements in return for Pyongyang simply beginning to abide by its previous commitments and UN resolutions. And it's also difficult to have dialogue with a country that shuns it. North Korea closed the New York Channel in July of 2016, and they only reopened it to facilitate the return of the comatose and dying Otto Warmbier. And Pyongyang walked away from senior level talks with South Korean counterparts in December 2015, which precipitated the collapse of inter-Korean engagement. And in the joint security area, North Korea literally doesn't pick up the phone, and it also literally doesn't pick up the phone in the West Sea inter-Korean hotline. So they've also repeatedly rejected President Moon's attempts at dialogue and engagement, and even offering humanitarian assistance. So proposals for returning to negotiations, such as the freeze for freeze option, all share a common theme, really, in calling for yet more U.S. concessions in return for a commitment by North Korea to simply undertake a portion of what it is already obligated to do under UN resolutions. So the best way to engage in negotiations would be after a comprehensive, rigorous, and sustained international pressure strategy. Doing so, it upholds U.S. laws and UN resolutions, it imposes a penalty on those that violate them, and it also puts in place measures to make it harder for North Korea to import and export components for its prohibited nuclear and missile programs. So North Korea should be held accountable for its actions, and really to refrain from doing so is to condone illegal activity and give de facto immunity to North Korea from laws and resolutions. So successive U.S. administrations have talked tough about imposing pressure, claiming that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth, which is not true. And engaged really in what I would call timid incrementalism in enforcing sanctions in U.S. law. So if you talk to U.S. officials who work sanctions, if you talk to them privately, they'll say, yeah, for years we've had lists and evidence against North Korean, Chinese, and other entities that are violating U.S. law, and we're sort of allowed to take out 10 or so entities every time North Korea does a provocation in order to punish them, and then we have to put the rest back in the drawer to save for the next provocation. So the effectiveness of international sanctions have been hindered by weak international implementation. We can be encouraged by Beijing's recent statements that its banks and businesses will not engage with their North Korean counterparts, but has always been the case with both U.S. and Chinese pledges of resolve to enforce laws against North Korea. We must see implementation and enforcement to move from potential to real significant actions. And the increasing North Korean capabilities has aggravated long-standing allied concerns about U.S. capability, resolve, and willingness to defend their countries. This trend, I think, is most prevalent here in South Korea, which fears a decoupled alliance in which the U.S. wouldn't trade Los Angeles for Seoul, to use the common refrain, once North Korea demonstrates an unambiguous ability to hit the American homeland with nuclear ICBMs. And so this strategic trepidation by South Korea has been a catalyst for advocating new military options, including reintroducing U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, which were removed in the 1990s. But these proposals are really based more on fear of abandonment rather than sound military reasoning. South Korea's fear that the U.S. will not come to their aid during a conflict, despite the blood that we shed mutually during the Korean War, despite a mutual defense treaty, despite presidential and senior official statements. But most significantly, the U.S. has committed its most precious resource, the lives of our sons and daughters in uniform, that we place in harm's way shoulder to shoulder with South Korea to defend your country. Those of us with children in the U.S. military, and my son is a United States Marine who just returned from service in Afghanistan, we don't make that commitment lightly, but we do so to defend freedom not only in the United States, but overseas. So, and the presence of a few nuclear weapons won't make that commitment any stronger. So the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. is a very somber reminder of those tragic events during 1950 to 1953. The inscription on the memorial honors those who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. But South Korea and its people now are very well known to Americans. We will be there for you, because yesterday, tomorrow, today, and tomorrow, it will remain kachi kapshira. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My first question is on the, focused on the decoupling of the security assurances between Washington and Seoul. I really appreciate your personal conviction that U.S. will faithfully fulfill its obligation to implement extended deterrence in whatever the case is. So it is. I'm also, when I visit recently the Washington and eastern and western coast, everybody's. Also most of the congressmen, joined such, strong commitment. But the problem is in Seoul, most of the people, many people have some suspicion. When North Korea really demonstrate the capability to hit Washington or New York, and then even that case, people have some doubt whether Washington will really protect Seoul or Tokyo, at the expense of Washington or Seattle or New York. So, which means that I think there is some assurance gap between Seoul and Washington. So maybe how you could bridge the gap. And if we need some more concrete measures, what is that from your point of view? My second question is, you mentioned the highlight and condemn Pyongyang's crime against humanity, during our discussion. So maybe that is a good point. I agree with you in the sense that the crimes against humanity fall into the category of the indictment in the International Criminal Court. Maybe that kind of idea was raised some part in the Korean, the academical. Or it might trigger a responsibility to protect, that is R2P process. So in this regard, what kind of, provocation of North Korea will constitute such category to indict their leaders to ICC? So that is my question. So you may respond, during your turn. My next speaker will be Professor Chu Feng from Nanjing University. Now he is working as Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of South China Sea and Professor of International Relations at Nanjing University. Actually, he is a product of the Peking University. And since joining Nanjing University, he has successfully turned Nanjing University into an academic base for research in maritime issues, particularly maritime territorial dispute. He and myself also collaborated to launch the first international academic conference entitled Nanjing Forum last year. I personally believe Dr. Zhu Feng is one of the most rational and far-sighted Chinese intellectuals, which is who has the most largest number of the Korean friends. I strongly recommend you to read his article recently published in Foreign Affairs entitled China's North Korean Liability. I'm delighted to invite Dr. Zhu to speak. Okay.
Thank you, President Park, and thanks for inviting me here. It's truly my big honor speaking something from my personal capacity. First of all, I think the question should be clarified for some sort of very drastic the purpose for us to denuclearizing the DPRK. I really like the President Moon's statement. Usually it's two critical, I think, goals really hitting the Seoul and the South Korea. And one is, we say, maintaining the peace and the prosperity in Korean Peninsula. The second is, we say, realization of universal value, because the DPRK is most severe human rights abuse country in the world. But we need one more objective. That objective is really, really unbelievably impensing. It is how to de-escalate the geopolitical competition in Northeast Asia. So this also some sort of leading goal, it seems to me, need all the regional countries to have in mind. So from this perspective, I consider DPRK's nuclear aspiration, of course, is very, very damaging. First, it wants to keep the region's survival. But second, I think go beyond the region's survival. It also wants some sort of a region sustainability in DPRK's favor. Because if they have a nuclear weapon in face of the non-nuclear armed South, then I think some sort of a power disparity, also very dramatically, remarkably lasting for at least 4 decades, also will reverse. That kind of a situation, to be honest, is also very scary to Chinese, because we don't want to see there will be any coerced reunifications from the North. That will be nightmare. That will be some sort of real disaster. So from this point, I think the DPRK's nuclear armament is truly a very destructive factors before the North Korean regime could be totally destroyed, as President Trump just promised. But the problem is how we can respond. I think basically things has never been more encouraging since President Xi Jinping and President Trump had the 2 rounds of a summit meeting. Then I see China and the US really pull closer on how to approach a very provocative DPRK. Then we will see latest the UN Security Council resolution also deeply touch the suspension of a refined oil provision to DPRK. It's almost some sort of a Chinese red line, because if Beijing decided to suspend the oil provision, what does it mean? That means China really finally would like to turn it back to Pyongyang. So then I see such a trend has never been more encouraging, with some sort of China's low proactive over the DPRK issue. I think the momentum has never been, it seemed to me, pleasing for us to get things done. So, but the problem is, in what way we can rebuild international consensus to get things moving forward? To my understanding, first of all, we should have some sort of a conviction on shared responsibility. For long term, I think the Western media always keep China accused of some sort of China liability. But the problem is Beijing always getting very unnerved about that kind of China liability assumption. But today, with some sort of the China's very interesting policy shifts, and the new consensus now is falling back again then we need some sort of new exemption. This new exemption is shared responsibility to underline international consensus and coordination. For example, we should unilaterally, we should identically and persistently respond if the DPRK provoked one more time. Then we also should think of some sort of a joint contingency plan if the things will be totally get out of the control, as long as the DPRK want to try some sort of military adventurism. Then another things also become very imminent. If the sanctions will be sustained, how domestic cracking down will happen in DPRK. All such things deserve, we say, some sort of a well-coordinated international response. So for the moment, I think the concept of shared responsibility has never been shining and echoing in the air. Then second is we also need well-coordinated roadmap. For example, how the talk could just resume, what kind of a condition the talk also could proceed. Freezing could be some sort of a condition to getting the talk back, or talk is the way to engage the DPRK even symbolically. All such things need to well weighed in international community. Then we should have some sort of shared vision on how such a roadmap could lead the main players, at least a bunch of players, could move forward. Then another one is, for example, the redeployment of a tactical nuclear weapon in Korean Peninsula. I consider it's really, really a bad idea. If the DPRK will use the nuclear weapon to jeopardize the South Korean, it's not the US, it's also China who will just standing against that kind of a very devastating, we say, threat. But the problem is deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon will add to some sort of the legitimacy of the DPRK's nuclear armament. So to be honest, I consider it's a really bad idea. On the other hand, if Japan just trying to take, or in other words, exploiting some sort of a DPRK's factor to remilitarize, that will be scare Chinese back. A nuclear Japan will be a disaster for China's national security? I don't think so. But the problem is a nuclear armed Japan will killing the legitimacy for some sort of a way, say, safety of the international regime of the non-proliferation. It also will cause some sort of chain reaction. Look at the now deepened complexity of the Iran nuclear deal, where I don't want to see some sort of such a negative spillover could also just sweeping through the nuclear security issues in the world. So then we need a roadmap. That roadmap should need some sort of a great power consent, should also has a cohesive connection to maintenance of a world order and the regional security. So from this point, what kind of a roadmap we can figure out? At least a couple of points really now is very striking. First, for example, we should try diplomatic priority rather than just automatically trigger preemptive military strike, because that will cause a lot of devastating uncertainties. The second is, if the diplomatic priority is always welcome, the problem is how international community could be represent some sort of, we say, division of labor based, we say, some sort of parts playing. For example, President Moon strongly asked for talk with the North. I think from my personal view, I consider it's a very, very positive, because talk is not a way to appease. Talk is the way to undercut the misperception. And the talk also could be a way to reinforce the action. So then we need some sort of division of labor based, some sort of a job assignment. Then another point to the roadmap is, to be honest, I think the key to denuclearization is a regime change. I don't think that Kim Jong-un, as long as Kim Jong-un stays power, the denuclearization could be accomplished. But the problem is, the regime change could be realized in peaceful manner or in diplomatic way. I think we can also sit in together exploring some sort of such a possibility. Last points of my suggestion is we need to embracing an effective strategy. North Korea's nuclear threat now is imminent. Their missile capability is also improved dramatically. Their missile is not definitely to US. To be honest, their missile probably is also now eventually to China. Even their nuclear test put China's border city on edge. That kind of things couldn't last without any substantive intervention. So what's the real base to underline the effectiveness of our strategy? We need to talk. So then, conclusively, I see, since has never been tricky, since the Kim Jong-un's some sort of nuclear and the missile aspiration. When President Trump used the word Rocky Man, I think there's quite a few words could match some sort of such a relevance. But the problem is, if we want to get out of some sort of such a devastating geopolitical disentanglement, DPRK issue is really, really a good driver for great power and the leading players just like Japan and the Korean to intensify cooperation. So this moment coming, and also is an unanswered test for Seoul, Beijing, Washington, and Tokyo either. Let me stop here.
You mentioned China's liability. Many international communities talking on that issues. From my personal perception on why China has his own liability. 2009, Chinese party decide. During the party foreign policy committee. 外事领导小组. Their decision was very decisive. Which prioritize peace and security of Korean Peninsula over denuclearization. It results in giving some green signals or safe conduct, to North Korea, so that they could develop a nuclear program with impunity, with a sense of impunity. That's the problem. So even though the current foreign minister, he mentioned that now we are focusing on the denuclearization with top priority. But still, the party itself didn't make any changes, which was made during the 2009 Hu Jintao period. So maybe that's why we continuously argue that China has some serious liability during the last 10 years. My second question, you mentioned that the reintroduction of the tactical nuclear weapon is a very, very serious challenge to China. As you might well aware, even in Korea, we are very divided. And then our president, officially, during the CNN interview, he clarified that we don't need, tactical, weapon as of now. But my, theoretical base in Europe, still there are 4 countries keeping 150, 190 tactical nuclear weapons. But Russia or the other countries never complain of that issues. So that's just for I'm not vindicate or advocate the possession of tactical nuclear weapon, but I think it's our decision whether Korea will Korea will reintroduce or co-share nuclear weapons with United States. That is our decision. That is our sovereign right, whether or not. So maybe why China is so adamantly opposed to that concept, because that is our security issues. And third, you mentioned on going nuclear, as you mentioned in the New York Times several times. Even on the going nuclear issues, maybe, I don't know when Korea will officially decide or not. Maybe I hope that moment will not come, forever. But I think, the going nuclear of Korea is quite different that of Japan. Because, Korea's going nuclear has some legitimate, base, in accordance with Article 10 of NPT. When, we have some serious challenge to the core interest of our security, Korea has some free options. So maybe, the neighboring country should respect the Korean government's decision or Korean people's decision. So there is also, the going nuclear by Korea quite different from that of Japan. So maybe what is your some comment on that argument? And my last comment is, I'm sorry, I have some too many for you. But you mentioned the regime change of North Korea. It's very challenging. I myself a little stunned with your comment. But can you clarify? It is regime change or leadership change of North Korea? So I will be highly appreciated if you make some clarification. No, you don't have to make a response right now. So I will give you some time. My next speaker will be Professor Jang To-sung. He's a senior fellow and the chairman of the academic committee and the director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies. He has served the People's Liberation Army Military College and the PLA National Defense University. In the 1990s, he was the Deputy Defense Attaché at the Chinese Embassy in the UK. His area of research is Sino-US relations, Sino-Japan relations, Asia-Pacific security, and China's foreign policy. Please welcome Chairman Jang To-sung.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to talk about the situation of DPRK nuclear situation and how to deal with the crisis. Since 2009, for regime survival, DPRK has increasingly strengthened its effort for going nuclear. In the past 2 years, it has made unexpected major progress on its nuclear program. Now, as DPRK sprints towards nuclear weaponization, its nuclear program is approaching the critical point. So now the experts just believe in 1 or 2 years, DPRK will cross the nuclear threshold and become a de facto nuclear weapon state. The outbreak and the escalation of the DPRK nuclear crisis has had a major negative impact on international and regional security till now. The escalating military confrontation between the US, ROK, and Japan on the one hand, and the DPRK on the other, has placed the peninsula under the shadow of military conflict and war. Looking into the future, if DPRK thoroughly crosses the nuclear threshold, the crisis will have the most disruptive impact on international and regional security. As the first country withdrawing from NPT and coming into possession of nuclear weapons against enormous international pressure, DPRK will set a very, very bad example in the world. Should the international community be forced to accept it, the domino effect will deal a major blow to the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, which may even collapse. On the other hand, if the US makes up mind to use force to disarm DPRK, even very limited surgical strike, it will contain huge risks of serious military conflict or war on the peninsula. The US, of course, hope that the military strikes will be successful. But will the US truly achieve its operational objectives? Should the DPRK retaliate or even use nuclear weapons in the showdown, the consequences could be rather unimaginable. In face of the severe situation, what should we do? Here, I'd like to share with you 3 points. Firstly, efforts should be made to resume dialogue as soon as possible. From now to February next year, there may be a window of opportunity for dual suspension and dialogue resumption. At that time, there will be no routine, large-scale joint military exercises between the US and ROK. I hope the relevant parties will seize the opportunity to resume dialogue. The six-party talk remains the best platform for dialogue. Any other form of dialogue should also be explored if they are beneficial for the denuclearization and peace and stability. The dialogue may be conducted in 2 steps. The first is to relax tension and realize nuclear freeze. The second is to realize denuclearization and establish a peninsular peace mechanism. Of course, there is one possibility that we really do not wish to see. That is, after resumption of dialogue and the relaxation of crisis situation, DPRK still refuses to engage in dialogue on denuclearization, or even withdraw from dialogue and conduct nuclear and missile tests again. Once that occurs, other parties should keep dialogue under the six-party talk framework to continue coordination and cooperation. I mean that at that time we should have 5-party talks. Secondly, so long as DPRK persists on its nuclear program, the UN Security Council's sanctions must be implemented earnestly and comprehensively. If DPRK continues with nuclear and missile tests, the sanctions should be tougher. However, we should always keep in mind that the sanctions themselves can't solve the DPRK nuclear issue and must be combined with other measures. Besides, we should try our best to prevent the sanctions from seriously damaging the livelihood of North Korean people. I'm sure following lasting, serious, and tough sanctions, the effectiveness of the sanctions will be seen in the future. DPRK will realize that its parallel development strategy will go nowhere. DPRK will be forced to make a policy change. Thirdly, the relevant parties must strengthen coordination and cooperation enhance common understanding, and effectively manage their differences. Nowadays in the USA, loud voices has appeared on the use of force to solve the DPRK nuclear issue. In Japan and the ROK, there have been more discussions about the option of going nuclear. I think China will firmly oppose to use military forces to solve the problem, and China will not support Japan and ROK to go to nuclear. Because the first one can only cause disastrous consequences that we can't bear. And if Japan and ROK go nuclear, Northeast Asia will be the hardest hit region by nuclear proliferation and the nuclear security and the nuclear safety challenge. Recently, there is another worrying voices in the US. For some people, the DPRK is becoming a de facto nuclear weapon state very soon, and the US cannot but accept it as a fact. Some even argue DPRK is not the primary threat, whereas China is the biggest adversary for the US. Will the US make peace or compromise with the DPRK at the expense of other parties? Although the likelihood is not very high, China has to stay alert. In a more likely scenario, as DPRK across the nuclear threshold thoroughly, the US will go all out to strengthen extended deterrence, military alliances, and the missile defense deployment, and get prepared for preemptive strike against DPRK. In that situation, the risk of regional military conflict and war will be higher, and China's security interests could be seriously threatened. Deployment of THAAD in ROK since last year has undermined China-US and especially China-ROK relations. If the US and its allies continue strengthening comprehensive military cooperation in disregard of China's security concerns, security differences and frictions between the US and China may well increase or even lead to arms race, seriously impeding denuclearization cooperation on the peninsula. In face of such a severe and complex situation, to better deal with the DPRK nuclear crisis and strengthen denuclearization cooperation, all relevant parties must endeavor to coordinate policies, manage differences, and increase common understanding. To this end, I propose 3 dialogues. The first is about nuclear freezing and denuclearization. The second is about dealing with emergencies and crisis management. The third is about how to avoid arms race and develop CBMs among 5 parties. There is not much time left before the crisis approaches the critical point. These dialogues should be started as soon as possible. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Zhang Tuosong. I have one. I'm very appreciate your 3-stage, phase, approaches. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to point one thing. When we talk about, nuclear freeze, I mean, people usually say freeze of testing of nuclear test and freezing of missile test. From my point of view, we overlooked other very important element, that is suspension of fissile material. The how many fissile material North Korea could secure is key element to make North Korea has second strike capabilities. So maybe we don't forget, the suspension of the fissile material should be included when you talk on freeze of nuclear facilities. So I wonder if you have some any idea how we could control stopping or sealing or capping North Koreans the stockpiling of fissile material. And second thing is that you mentioned the de facto recognizing de facto nuclear state. But I think we should be very careful because we look back in India-Pakistan case. De facto nuclear state means lift of the sanction or release or alleviation of the hard sanction. So maybe if we recognize North Korea as de facto nuclear state, all UN sanctions should be removed. It's nonsense. So maybe, so in that sense, it's very dangerous for us to talk on that possibilities. So maybe I'd like to invite your, comment. Our last speaker will be former Minister Yoon Young-kwan. He's emeritus, professor of Seoul National Universities. So prior to joining Seoul National University, he taught at UC Davis. As everybody is well aware of it, Dr. Yoon has published many books and articles on Korea's foreign policy, inter-Korean relations, and international political economy. Really, he is a really good asset, to our, intellectual pool, dealing these very thorny issues. Let's welcome Dr. Yoon as the last speaker. You have your floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Park. And it is my great pleasure to have this important opportunity to speak before the distinguished guest and panelists. North Korean situation is very, very complicated and difficult. So I would like to introduce my way of viewing this situation, my way of analyzing this situation. First, let me begin from what is North Korea's intention. I think there are two kinds of intention. First, defensive intention. I think North Koreans want to ensure their regime survival. Kim Jong-un might have witnessed what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Gaddafi in Libya. So, he used to say that he would never give up nuclear option. And another defensive intention is that they want to deter U.S. intervention in a crisis situation on the Korean Peninsula. For example, they want to deter reinforcement of U.S. military forces into the Korean Peninsula. For that purpose, they developed various kinds of missiles. For example, they developed Scud missiles and Rodong missiles to be able to hit U.S. military bases and ports in South Korea and Japan to prevent a massive flow of U.S. reinforcement in the emergency situation. And they also developed ILBM to be able to hit Guam, very important strategic military base of the United States. Finally, they developed ICBM to be able to hit U.S. mainland. In addition, they have some kind of aggressive intention. First, they want to compel U.S. to accept North Korea's nuclear status by threatening with nuclear-armed ICBMs. And they pursue an aggressive agenda of reunification in line with the official doctrine, with military force if necessary. For example, they may argue that we need to conclude a peace treaty with them, and once peace treaty is concluded, they will say that since we are no more enemy, why don't you withdraw your troops from South Korea? And why don't you stop, your alliance with South Korea or something like that? And that will prepare a better political environment for unification, communist unification. I think those are the North Korean intention to develop nuclear weapons and missiles. On the other hand, President Trump is clear that the U.S. can never tolerate nuclear armament by North Korea. And he regards North Korea's nuclear and missile development as the most urgent security threat. And he announced that maximum pressure and engagement as U.S. North Korea policy. And the purpose of this maximum pressure is, of course, to bring North Koreans to the table to negotiate on denuclearization. In this kind of situation, I think we are facing three kinds of scenarios. One is military conflict scenario, the other is bargaining scenario. And if our bargaining cannot be achieved peacefully, probably the final default option, default scenario may be containment and deterrence. Let me briefly explain about these three scenarios. First, military conflict scenario. I don't think there will be high likelihood of all-out war resulting from an intentional attack by each side. North Korea knows that if they attack South Korea or US military base, there will be massive retaliation against them, and probably that may mean the end of their regime and the end of the life of Kim Jong-un himself. So they may think it is better accomplish complete nuclear program and missile program without the risk of war. From the US point of view, it is also difficult to attack North Korea except in the case of imminent threat. So we cannot exclude the preemptive strike because it will totally depend on North Korea's behavior in coming months or years. And also there will be some retaliation of North Korea if they are attacked against South Korea. I think this kind of possibility is low. But what I'm concerned more is the possibility of unintended accidental war caused by misperception, misjudgment, and overreaction. Because there are many cases in the world history wars caused by this kind of misperception and misjudgment. A famous historian, A.J.P. Taylor, once mentioned that many European wars were started by a threatened power which had nothing to gain by war and much to lose. So I think we had better be careful That's why I think it is important. Strong rhetorics exchanged by both leaders in the United States and North Korea is not very desirable. Both sides need to send a clear, consistent signal that so that the other side would not misunderstand their intention. So I think North Koreans should be very careful, and they should try not to provoke a verbal war. And the US side also need to send a clear signal consistently that US goal is not regime change or preventive war, but policy change. What I mean is denuclearization. Let me explain about the second scenario, bargaining scenario. U.S. official, I think we can think three kind of bargaining scenario. One is one which is pursued by President Trump nowadays. President Trump aims complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization at once. And I think this is the most desirable scenario if possible. And the West will return by providing economic aid, diplomatic opening, or security guarantee, etc., if North Korea denuclearizes in this way. But however, without strongest economic sanction from China, Kim will not move. That's my thinking. I think the success or failure of this scenario will depend on how strongly China will apply sanction against North Korea. If China fully cooperates and applies strongest sanction, and North Korean economy becomes very difficult, and Kim Jong-un feels the pressure from the bottom, then probably Kim will change his strategic calculation and come to the table and discuss denuclearization. The second option, bargaining scenario may be freeze first, denuclearize later option. I think this is less ambitious and more realistic goal. It argues that it is better to focus on freezing North Korea's nuclear and missile program first and denuclearizing North Korea later. And North Korea in turn may demand lifting of sanctions or suspension of military exercise or conclusion of peace agreements or something like that. I think we consider these demands from the North Korean side closely watching how much North Korea cooperatively come to the, how much North Korea cooperate. I think the strength of this option is opening of communication channel and reduction of tension and possibility of higher Chinese cooperation. But the weakness is how much North Korea will cooperate. We really do not know. And this formula may be criticized as actual acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear state. And another important issue is if President Trump withdraws from the Iran deal, North Korea would not come to the table. So I sincerely hope that US government stick to the Iran deal. And South Korea may face a more emboldened and provocative North Korea if, if this scenario comes true. Finally, the third bargaining scenario is a kind of big deal between the US and China. Henry Kissinger and Graham Allison argued for making a big deal between the United States and China. The US satisfies demand of China regarding Korea in return for China's denuclearizing North Korea. As a Korean, I'm concerned about the possibility of a deal between big powers sacrificing South Korea's own security interest. And finally, the third scenario is containment and deterrence. It's a kind of default option, as I already explained. If international society fails to denuclearize North Korea, after all, it will have to accept the reality, and then US will shift its policy toward the long-term containment and deterrence against North Korea as it did in the Cold War years. And this new world will be also, worse than, as bad as the current situation, and there will be high possibility of nuclear proliferation, which will be against China's national interest, and that's why I recommend strong cooperation from the Chinese side. Finally, I'd like to mention just one thing. I hope, we need to, both sides, US and North Korea, both sides will have to avoid cornering one another. I think 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was a very good example how prudent decision was, saved the world. And a similar approach, I think, is required as of now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have very time constraint. I will give you two to 3 minutes. Sorry. Okay, Gary.
Okay, well, I'll be very quick. So you asked, why did diplomacy fail? Was it because of ineptitude and inattention on the part of the United States? Well, I would never say the US was perfect, but if I look at the collapse of the 1994 agreed framework, the 2005 six-party statement, and the 2012 leap day deal, I would say all of those collapsed because of North Korean action, either because they cheated on the agreement or because they decided to walk away, to renege. So in my view, the fundamental reason why diplomacy has failed and will continue to fail in terms of achieving denuclearization is because North Korea is deeply committed to retaining a nuclear weapons capability for regime survival. And I don't think there's anything we can offer North Korea or anything we can threaten North Korea with that will effectively remove that motivation. Now, that doesn't mean diplomacy is useless, because diplomacy still plays a value in terms of limiting and delaying the program, but I don't personally think we can count on diplomacy to solve the problem as long as the Kim dynasty is ruling in Pyongyang. And I think ultimately, as others have said, the solution is in regime change, but I don't think regime change is something that is within our power. Maybe China can achieve regime change, and I welcome the Chinese to make an effort to carry that out, but I don't think the US is in a position to achieve regime change by itself. You asked about the NATO formula. Yes, if North Korea attacked the United States, that would trigger the security alliance, but I think the fundamental factor that deters North Korea is the strength of the US position and its security relationship with its allies in the region. And I agree with Minister Yun, the danger here is not a big attack from North Korea against South Korea or the US, or a big attack from the US and South Korea against the North. The big danger is one of miscalculation and escalation of minor skirmishes. Up to now, I'd say Kim Jong-un has been remarkably restrained. Unlike under his father's rule, we haven't seen Cheonan sinking, Waipido Island shelling. So far, Kim Jong-un has been very careful. What I worry about is that after he's achieved a long-range nuclear capability, he will become more aggressive in terms of conventional threats against the ROK. And I think the US and the ROK need to build up their conventional deterrent. That may mean more US troops based in Korea and more US assets in the region in order to respond to a minor conventional threat. Finally, on a grand bargain between the US and China, I've always been skeptical. I think the relationship between US and China, the strategic competition, the lack of confidence, really stands in the way of a big bargain, and I'm not sure either side can deliver in terms of what they would promise. But I do think there's more room for cooperation, tactical cooperation between Beijing and Washington than ever before. And that's because of Kim Jong-un's behavior. So we should try to take advantage of the opportunity he is presenting to us in order to strengthen cooperation with the US and China on a strategy of coercive diplomacy. More economic pressure, but also a roadmap to try to come to some diplomatic agreement to restrain the program.
I'll focus on your question about the assurance gap. Allies are always nervous because they're relying on someone else for part of their security, so it's a natural phenomena. But on the assurance gap, is it something that the US has not delivered enough, or is it that South Korea has an insatiable appetite to be reassured? Many of the things, or most of the things that are being proposed now really make no military sense. The reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons, the ground weapons that we remove no longer exist, we don't use them. The remaining nuclear weapons are on very hard to find submarines and airplanes. And so what people are proposing is taking them off those hard to find platforms and putting them into a very easy to find bunker in South Korea. So it degrades our military capabilities. It's like telling a policeman, take all the bullets out of your gun and put them back at police headquarters. You've degraded the combat capabilities, the deterrence capabilities. You've increased the likelihood that North Korea will engage in a preemptive attack on that very high value target. And in a crisis, you may even feel constrained from removing the nuclear weapons from the bunker, lest it cause North Korea to think you are about to attack them. So really, it's based on this concern about the US won't be there. And it's really an endless quest. It's like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in it. There will never be complete reassurance. If it's not tactical nuclear weapons, it'll be nuclear weapons of your own. And if it's not that, then it's parking carriers and submarines and bombers, either increased rotations or permanently in South Korea, and then there will be more, always a need for more. And reassurance is a two-way street. You know, the US would say, what are you doing to reassure us that you will actually fully fund your defense requirements, that your defense reform program won't be delayed yet again, as it has many times. And in a way, I think it's in a way a bit insulting, or the US can take umbrage in that it's, we have a treaty, we have presidential statements, we have our forces here, and you still don't believe that we will be there. We were willing to take an estimated 100 million or so casualties in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, in essence sacrificing Bonn or London, New York, Washington, and LA for Bonn, Paris, and London, and we were there for them. Thank God we never had to prove that, and we hope we never have to prove it during a war here in Asia, but we are here for you.
Okay, very briefly responding to the President Park's question, let me start from the last one. For me, I think in the case of the DPRK, regime change and leadership change really make no difference. So then whatever our definition is, that leadership is just notably equal to the regime in the DPRK because the family control is the most, we say, totalitarian government in the world. So then for me, leadership change is eventually equal to the regime change. But the problem is, usually we will see regime change in the DPRK probably will cost some sort of blood or some sort of military actions, but probably also will happen in some sort of a peaceful way. Then, for example, if we look at the collapse of socialist East European systems. Then we will see the dramatic change originated after the Mao's passed away in 1976. Then we will see the history probably will offer some sort of a chance, such a peaceful regime change may be likely. So then the question is, what will be a last straw to smash the DPRK's camel? For example, then we can think through some sort of how long DPRK can withstand some sort of toughest sanctions posted so far. And all such things now has never been, I think, more eminent for a scholar to explore. Then second question, South Korea's technical nuclear deployment, China is opposed to. My view is just I say, we are less concerned how technical nuclear weapon you will deploy. But the problem is we are really concerned some sort of a chain reaction, some sort of negative spillover. On the other hand, if we know the history of the nuclear strategy evolution, some sort of countries just like the South Korean with a very narrow territory for shutting off strategic in-depth, the nuclear development, of course, is not a good idea. It's not the new Cold War. It's not some sort of, we say, very impending, we say, such a wars threatening. So I don't think that nuclear weapons deployment will be a very reliable countermeasure. The first question is how the China's DPRK policy changed. Yes, for long, China's policy of DPRK had been very consistent and very, we say, congested. But the problem is why recently such a policy showing a very dramatic shift. I think basically two reasons. One is Kim Jong-un regime is really different from the Kim Jong-il regime. Without the regime change, but Pyongyang's some sort of a performance has profoundly changed. Kim Jong-un is not just a missile guy. He can't wait longer, showing some sort of his technological advancement. Most important thing is such a string of nuclear missile tests, not just to provoke the region, but also provoke China. So from this point, I think the DPRK, the provocation on the Kim Jong-un regime is a real drive for China's policy reconsideration. The second is, then we will see South Korean change. Back to 10 years ago, when Lee Mu-sheng government came to power, sanction policy is good. It's some sort of way to soften the DPRK's such a hardlining policy. But now the Moon Jae-in government came to power. He also vowed some sort of return of sanction policy. But my understanding is Moon Jae-in's policy of national security is a little bit closer to traditional, we say, such a conservative, line of the national security strategy. So given such two factors, North Korea changed, South Korea changed, how we can follow up. So I think the China's shift is some sort of more relevant to some sort of such a dynamic change in surroundings.
Okay, Professor.
Two questions for me. The first is about whether stop the two missile and the nuclear tests. Okay. I don't think so. This is only create a condition for resume talks. But when we resume talks, the medium and the future medium goal should be the nuclear freeze. It will cover all the nuclear program. And it should be verified, the freeze. So this is the first. Secondly, I think we should never about in the future North Korea's position. And I think we should never admit North Korea as a nuclear state. That's the first. Secondly, even we resumed talks, we should not immediately and comprehensively lift the sanctions. No. If only when they realize the nuclear program freeze, then we can gradually limit some sanctions. And if in the future they agree to talk about the denuclearization, then word for word, action for action, finally, maybe all the sanctions could be lifted. The third point is, if we want to lift the sanctions against North Korea, it should be ratified by the UN Security Council, not just by one country. So that's very clear, because sanctions is just come from the UN Security Council. And also need 5 parties agreement. That's very, very important. Finally, I want to say one point. Unfortunately, in recent 2 years, the North Koreans' parallel development of strategy has made some success. So we must change this situation, force them to change their policy.
Very briefly.
Yeah. My remark will be brief. I'd like to request the US side and the China side just simple, but very important thing in my mind. One is, to the US side, I sincerely hope that Trump administration send very carefully calibrated, consistent signal to the North Korean side. I think that will be very important to avoid the possibility of danger or risk caused by misperception and misjudgment and possible escalation into a general war. To the Chinese side, I'd like to ask them to fully cooperate this time in terms of applying maximum sanctions. Actually, one of the important reasons why we arrived at this kind of dangerous situation was the lack of international coordination. And China, I think this time had better be fully 100% cooperative in terms of applying sanctions against North Korea. Otherwise, the world we are facing will be a multi-nuclear state East Asia, which will be very, against China's security interest. So I think it's time for China to make an important decision.
I will skip my conclusion. Instead, I'd like to invite two, leading, great, forerunners of our project, Chris Hill, Secretary Chris Hill.
Where do you want me to stand? To the audience or to the? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Park. I want to especially thank Gary Seymour for not suggesting that all of the U.S. negotiation in the past has been completely inept. Thank you for that compliment, Gary. What I would like to do is, though, direct to our Chinese friends a couple of questions. When you talk about threat, one should talk about capabilities and intentions. And you were remarkably silent on the question of North Korean intentions. Are they simply trying to preserve their regime, or do they have something more ambitious in mind, which is what I suspect they have? Secondly, I'd like to ask Chairman Zhang on the question of getting negotiations going. We all like negotiations, but what do we do about the fact that North Korea previously agreed to abandon all their nuclear programs and return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty at an early date? Do we simply ignore what they previously agreed to, or do we expect that they should maybe agree to that again before having negotiations? Otherwise, it's a little like having a negotiation with someone suffering from some mental disorder, because the day after we agree to something, they say, no, we didn't agree to it. So I think we might want to look at that question. And to Bruce Klinger, I'd like to ask one question. There is nothing the North Koreans have ever said that you would necessarily believe, and yet you seem to believe that they would never give up their nuclear weapons ever in the future. I would argue that we can come together working closely with China, working with our allies, to create a circumstance where that will also prove to be a North Korean falsehood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, thanks for your great, presentation, and also, tolerance, till the last minute for your attending this very timely discussion. Okay, thanks so much.